Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Heidi Haynes, and I'm the Executive Director at the Rocky Mountain Down Syndrome Association. And we are so excited to have Dennis Roy here. He is going to be talking to us about waivers and the CFC program, and I'm sure some other topics. Dennis, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everybody just a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so my name is Dennis Roy, and I'm the Director of Operations for Colorado Family Caregivers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, as well as all of you that see this recorded down the road. Really appreciate you taking the time to kind of listen to me talk for a little while. Let me first start off by telling you a little bit about Colorado Family Caregivers. We are a licensed as both a Class A, Class B, as well as what's called a PASA agency to provide services to Medicaid members throughout Colorado. We were originally founded to predominantly serve children and families on the Children's Extensive Supports and the Supported Living Services, or SLS waiver. But we have recently, and by recently I mean the last couple of years, expanded a lot of our services to other areas as well. And I'll touch on that a little bit as we go through the presentation tonight. But as a provider agency, we are currently serving, but last I checked, we were just over 3,500 clients throughout the Front Range of Colorado, and I think we're over like 5,000 caregivers at this point. So we were started as a very small family-owned business, and we are still very family-owned, and we try to keep that kind of culture to both our internal staff as well as all the caregivers and families we support. But we are very large at this point and serving a pretty high quantity of people and services all up and down the Front Range, like I said. So that is us for Colorado Family Caregivers. Um, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides here, I think, and just start running with it, okay?
Okay, sounds good. And I'll keep an eye on the chat box too. And just to remind everyone, we will have an option for a Q&A at the end. So feel free to use the chat box, but also just know that we will have a time for questions at the end of the presentation.
Yep. If you can, I am learning Zoom again here. It's been a little while since I used Zoom, and so I'm going to move some windows around to get myself oriented. But
Okay.
um, hopefully everybody can see my slides at this point. Is that
Yes,
sharing?
we can.
Okay.
Looks good.
All right, so my housekeeping stuff. I already talked about Colorado Family Caregivers a little bit there. Like I said, we're family owned company, but we do serve a pretty high volume of people across predominantly still the supported living services, or SLS, and the Children's Extensive Supports, or CES waiver. But we've branched out into some skilled care, so with parent CNA programs. We also provide services through what's called in-home support services, or IHSS, and the Community First Choice program, which is going to be a lot of what this presentation is about here. So just real quick, this is my most embarrassing part of any presentation that I give, but I like to talk about it just a little bit. That my background is actually, I have a master's degree in public administration, and I entered the Colorado Medicaid system way back in 2013. It'll be, so what is that, 12 years next month, if my math is correct. Um, that I have been working in the Colorado long-term care system. My first 6 years were actually working for the state at the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, or HCPF, where while I was at HCPF, I managed one of the waivers for the first few years. And then after we did a little bit of a reorg there at HCPF for the last couple years while I was there, I was the primary liaison between HCPF, so the state of Colorado, and the federal government. So I handled all the negotiations of the different waiver agreements between the state and the feds. Um, a couple little just asides about me. I am a completely informal presenter. You will notice that I am very animated with my hands. I talk with my hands a lot. I'll ask your forgiveness for that if it gets obnoxious at any point in time, but I am pretty animated. I'm also incredibly informal. So any of you that are on the call tonight, if there is some kind of question that you want to get clarification from me on, please feel free to, you can unmute ask your question that way. I believe Zoom has the raise your hand function, put it in the chat. However, I am happy to be interrupted. My one little caveat about that I will say is that because we are limited on time just a little bit, I want any questions if you're going to ask during the presentation, please ask them in the context of like clarifying the topic or the subject that I'm trying to explain as compared to asking about this kind of situation is going on for me. If you want to have those conversations, I'm happy to do those after the presentation is over with. Try to talk that through and troubleshoot with you. But if you're going to do it during the presentation, let's keep them a little bit more context related. And also on those lines, I think when we get into the Q&A, if there is any personal health information, please let Heidi and I know before you ask that kind of question, so that way we can turn off the recording at that point. But otherwise, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Okay, that is my background. So I said I worked at HickPuff, talked about questions there a little bit. I'll also say that in between working at HickPuff and coming to Colorado Family Caregivers, I also worked for Developmental Pathways for 4 years. I think it was like 4 years and some change, where I was a program director for them. First, just generally within the program quality department, led them through the portions of COVID and that launch, as well as then implementation of case management redesign before then moving to Colorado Family Caregivers about a year ago. Hope that makes sense. For Medicaid and acronyms, my next bullet on here, this is about just the nature of the world that we live in with long-term care Medicaid. There are a lot of acronyms. There are literally pages and pages of glossaries of acronyms that I have seen at the state level, at the local levels, within provider agencies. And so I will do my best as we go through.
About shower time and like
Oh, can we make sure we're muting our lines if you don't mind? I will try to avoid acronyms whenever possible, or at least explain the acronym before going too much further into the conversation. But if I slip in and speak in an acronym that no one understands, feel free to put that into the chat and I will try to explain that. So I think that's all of my housekeeping pieces. Um, to kick off this conversation of home and community-based services and HCBS, which then leads into the conversation about waivers and all of that, I need to explain and kind of give what I might describe as like a 45,000 foot view of what is long-term care Medicaid within Colorado. And this does largely apply to most states around. So in Medicaid, when you talk to a policy wonk or like a recovering policy wonk like I am, there are two parts to Medicaid, and in a lot of ways. The first is what we call state plan Medicaid. Most people will just call this regular Medicaid or just Medicaid regular. It is what most people think of when they are thinking of Medicaid. This is when someone gets onto Medicaid in the more traditional way of, say, by being what we call categorically eligible or being eligible by virtue of their household income. That gets them access to the state plan, which the state plan consists of a menu of services that are what we might also call just typical health care. So if you are on Medicaid by virtue of being eligible because of household income, you get access to primary care physician visits, PCP visits. You get access to a lot of pharmaceutical costs or coverage. You get access to things like acute care long or acute care home care. You get access to certain facility-based services. Namely, if you are put into the hospital for a long period of time and you are unable to pay the hospital, you can obtain Medicaid coverage through the state plan. Every state that has the Medicaid program, which is all 50 of them, has to cover hospital costs and has to cover skilled nursing facility costs. These are all a part of that basic part of Medicaid that a state has to enact because of the way that the Social Security Act was written. And so this is what we call the state plan for services, okay? Um, that is as compared to what we call home and community-based services, which I will start using the acronym of HCBS here. So that is home and community-based services. I like to tell the story that HCBS largely started because of one mom and one daughter in Iowa. It was The daughter, her name is Katie Beckett, and Katie was born with some disabilities, and to where at 2 years into her life, she was in a situation where as long as she was in the hospital, she had Medicaid coverage. So she had very long-term care needs. This is in the 80s, I believe it was like 81 or 82, something like that. Um, Again, as long as she was in the hospital, she had Medicaid coverage. The problem for her family arose is that Katie's mom and dad had relatively high income to where once Katie left the hospital, her Medicaid coverage was dependent on her mom and dad's income, which then meant that she wasn't able to have Medicaid anymore because her parents made too much money. However, as soon as she went back into the hospital, she'd be in the hospital for 30 days, Medicaid covered her services. As the story goes, as I have been told it, there was one night where Katie Beckett's mom snuck into the Oval Office, something that I think we can all agree would never happen in this day and age. But she snuck into the Oval Office and got Ronald Reagan's attention one night and explained to Ronald Reagan how this circumstance where Medicaid was covering Katie's services as long as she was in the hospital, but Katie couldn't come home was just outrageous. It wasn't good for Katie and Katie's care. It also wasn't good for fiscally speaking because the payments that Medicaid was having to pay to keep Katie in the hospital were much more expensive than what would happen if Katie went home and received care in her home. And so, as I understand it, Ronald Reagan then said like this was a classic case of bureaucracy getting in the way of services, and he signed an executive order that then later turned into congressional acts that is now our HCBS service. At least that's the way I understand this story, right? The point is, and the reason why I tell that part of it is that the intent of HCBS is to make sure that people can stay in their homes and community, that they aren't confined into an institution. And so on another slide here, I'm going to talk about like what does institutional care mean? How do we define it? How do we determine someone is at that kind of a level of care? But it's important to understand that when we talk about HCBS, as compared to the state plan, it is for the intent of keeping people out of institutions. Okay. It, I hope everybody understands that. Put a question into the chat if there are any questions for that specifically. The bottom of my slides here, I put the question of what gets waived because throughout my career in working in HCBS here in Colorado, I feel like one of the most common things I hear is sometimes people saying like, "Oh, my child has their waiver now, and so they're getting these services," or "I got onto the waiver," or that there's just this question of what is actually being waived. And the answer to that is some of those requirements that the state plan has that HCBS doesn't have. As an example, the state plan has to have hospital care on it. Someone has to have access to the hospital. Someone has to have access to skilled nursing facilities. There is a waiver agreement between the state and the feds that says we will waive those requirements that people go on to into those institutions if you provide these other services. And the state has the ability to determine what those other services are. As an example, because I'm talking to the Rocky Mountain Down Syndrome Association here, an example could be if a child is on the CES waiver, that risk for what's called intermediate care facility placement is waived so that way the child can get onto the Children's Extensive Supports or CES waiver. And once they are on that CES waiver, they then have access to services such as home accessibility adaptations, also known as home modifications. They have access to the community connector service. They have access to respite. The rules around those services, let's use respite as the example, are waived by this agreement between the state and the feds to establish a waiver program. And so that is what it means when someone is on a waiver. It means that they are really on a waiver program or a program that was established because the federal government waived some requirements so that way the state could implement these other programs. Okay, so if you want that little kind of trivial pursuit knowledge or just trivia knowledge, that is why they are called waivers, is because you're waiving requirements of the Social Security Act. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Uh, On my next slide here, I want to talk about eligibility for the waiver programs. This is probably one of the most common questions that I get is how does someone then get onto a waiver? And I'm going to start here by talking about the state plan real quick, so that way we cover what is those categorically eligible pieces, and then use that to explain how these other parts are waived for these programs. The state plan and quote unquote regular Medicaid, people get onto Medicaid traditionally because they are living in a household income. And if they are categorically eligible, that means that their household income is lower than 138% of the federal poverty guidelines. So the federal government publishes these guidelines. It's the Department of Health and Human Services. Every year they publish what the poverty level is. If you are at 138% or lower than that federal guidelines, then the whole household is determined to be eligible for Medicaid and they can have access to those state plan services. One of the primary areas within waivers that does get waived um, is around eligibility. So if someone has a long-term care disability, they can waive those requirements around income to then get onto the waiver program and have access to both the state plan and the HCBS waivers. I'm going to say that again because I didn't cover it on the last slide. That if someone, once they are on a waiver, they have access to both those services that the waiver authorizes, as well as the services on the state plan. So even though it's a different eligibility process, someone on a waiver program does get access to both areas of services. Okay. So since this part is waived, I will say that there are three different components to waiver eligibility. The first is what we call the targeting criteria, which the targeting criteria is specific to each waiver program. In Colorado, we currently have 9 waiver programs. I've mentioned the Supported Living Services, SLS waiver. For this population here in this group of the Rocky Mountain Down Syndrome Association, you're going to be interested in that SLS waiver or the DD or the Developmental Disabilities waiver. Those are going to be the two waivers that apply to the adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. When we talk about children, there is the CES that I've mentioned, Children's Extensive Supports Waiver, or the CHIRP waiver, which is CHRP, that stands for the Children's Habilitative Residential Program, that waiver program. Those are going to be the 4 waivers that are in Colorado for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The targeting criteria, my first bullet at the top here for these particular waivers is that someone has to have been determined to have a developmental disability. In Colorado, we have 2 stages of this. We have a disability or developmental disability delay determination. That is for any children under the ages of 5, or when someone reaches the age of 5, and then throughout their adulthood or their adult life, they can have a developmental disability determination or a DDD. Okay. The way that those are defined is if the person has either an IQ that is tested to be at 70 or below, meaning that they are 2 standard deviations below the average for intelligence, or if something called the Adaptive Behavior Composite Score, or the ABC, is at 70 or below. If someone meets either of those in standardized testing, they are declared to have a developmental disability or a developmental delay, and then they meet the targeting criteria for those 4 waivers. Okay, so that is point one for any, whether it be a child or an adult, to get onto one of these IDD waivers, they do have to meet that targeting criteria. The second thing that I have on here is the functional eligibility. This is referring to that the person has to be at risk for institutional placement. Another area where we are waiving the requirements of the state plan is to declare that someone is at risk for institutional placement. And so, in order to serve them better in the home and community and to be cost effective, they have to be determined to be at need of those kinds of services. For everybody that's on this call, I'm going to guess that you have had a conversation with a case manager at some point in time where you have completed something called the 100.2 assessment or the ULTC 100.2. It's also sometimes called the long-term care assessment or the long-term care certification. All of this is the same assessment, goes by a lot of different names and the common lingo that is out there. What these assessments do is they go over the what is called the activities of daily living or the ADLs, where they talk about is someone able to complete their bathing process independently, or are they able to complete their eating process independently? Are they able to be supervised? Or do they require supervision either because of cognitive needs or just general supervision needs? Like, do they require that level of supervision or are they independent? Um, a case man under the current system, a case manager completes this for all of the ADLs. And if someone scores at a two, what's called a two or higher, meaning that they require either moderate or total assistance in these ADLs, they are determined to be at risk of institutional placement. And so, therefore, they meet the functional eligibility and they are that one step closer to being onto a waiver program. Brianna, I saw your question in the chat for a moment there, and then it looks like you might have deleted it. For what I saw, I'll answer it to say that someone can be on both, or if they're on waiver programs, they're also on state plan. But if they're on state plan, they're not necessarily on the waiver program. I'll say that again since I jumbled it. If someone's on the waiver programs, they do have access to Medicaid and the state plan, but if they're on state plan, they may not have access to the waiver. I hope that helps. Okay, so that was functional eligibility. Financial eligibility, I've kind of touched on, but it's complicated. Financial eligibility, there is still one there, but it's not that 138% of the federal poverty line that I was talking about earlier. It's also not determined at the household level. When we're talking about these waiver programs, because they're in the long-term care category of Medicaid, they're determined on the individual level based off of that individual's income and resources, and it has a higher threshold. And so for a lot of circumstances here in Colorado, the financial limit is 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. So what that means is that if an individual is on, let's say, the supported living services or SLS waiver, if they're on that waiver and they have a job, they are able to have enough income to reach that 300% level of the federal poverty lines and still maintain that waiver eligibility. So someone can have a job, period, and still be on a waiver program. Okay, it is not that someone has to be unemployed in order to be on these programs. There is that limit of 300%. So once someone gets there, they need to be mindful of what their income and assets are, so that way they don't break that threshold of the 300%. But I'll also return to it's determined at the individual level. So for anyone on this call, if you have an adult child living in your home that is working, the supported living services waiver or even the DD, the developmental disabilities waiver, those two waivers have supported employment. Everybody can go have a job, be an active participant in the workforce, and still maintain their waiver eligibility up until that 300% of the federal poverty lines. Then, say they're being very successful in their job, um, and continuing to make more money, getting a promotion at work, whatever is going on. Colorado in the last, it's been largely within the last, like, let's call it 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that. Colorado has implemented something called the adult buy-in programs, which really just means that we added a buy-in option into our waivers. So that way, if someone is between 300% of federal poverty lines or 400% of federal poverty lines, they can then buy into the waivers, which means that they pay a monthly premium. It's a sliding scale that actually starts at zero and goes through, I believe it's $120 a month. And if they pay that monthly premium, they can then buy into the waivers. So that way they get access to both the waiver coverage as well as state plan coverage. And so for the adults, on waiver programs, they have a lot of options here. One, it's again worth noting that the income is determined on the individual level by virtue of them having a disability. Okay. The other thing that I will note is that you have these buy-in programs, and so they can still have a job and have that active participation in the workforce and in their community. That is a large part of the intent of HCBS. They can have that access without having to give up their waiver eligibility. For children, um, it's both more complicated and less complicated. What is less complicated is that children's financial eligibility, again, because it's determined on an individual basis, is only dependent on the child's income. Parental income does not matter to a child getting onto a waiver. In 99.1% of the time, parental income doesn't matter to a child getting onto a waiver program because most children are not going to have a job that would take them over 300% of the federal poverty lines. So, for the most part, it's simple. Where I do like to caution parents wherever I talk to them, though, is that there are two kind of areas that I encourage families to consult with a financial planner about when their child is on a waiver program, just to make sure all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And that is any type of situation where there is, if it's a co-parenting family, where there is any type of child support being provided to one family, that child support can sometimes be attributed to the child's income. And so, if that child support is going that way, the family would want to consult with a financial planner to handle all of that and how that might impact the child's eligibility. The other circumstance can be certain trusts can be determined to be counted as the child's income and assets if they're not set up appropriately. I by no means am an expert on ABLE accounts. I suspect probably some people on this call today know more about ABLE accounts than I do, but whenever possible, I encourage families to talk with the financial advisor to set up ABLE accounts so that way that is taken care of and you don't risk Medicaid eligibility for the waivers that way. So those are the three like big policy areas that in order to find someone eligible for a waiver, they have to meet the targeting criteria, they have to meet the functional eligibility, and they have to meet the financial eligibility. Real quick, I'll go over a few of these things here that people just hear about eligibility and it causes the confusion that is out there. And I'll just touch on them and try to tie them to those policy areas. So for state plan eligibility or Medicaid, what I have down here in the lower left part of my slides, this is categorically eligible, is referring to if someone qualifies just based on their income. If someone is an adult living on their own, and they have an income that is lower than 138% of the federal poverty lines, they could just be categorically eligible and they don't have to maintain that waiver eligibility to get access to the state plan. So if you had an adult who was on the SLS waiver and did not have had a job but didn't cross that 138% of federal poverty lines, they would be eligible for state plan without their waiver eligibility. So that is categorically eligible. The other term that comes up around eligibility that is just super confusing is something called a disability determination. This is different than what I explained earlier as far as a developmental disability determination or a DDD, or for a child under the age of 5, it's a developmental disability delay. Those determinations are for the targeting criteria that's on my slide. There is another thing that is called a disability determination, which is where a vendor from the state reviews someone's list of diagnoses and determines that they have a long-term that their diagnoses meet the definition of a long-term care disability. For everybody on this call, I'm going to assume that this is largely a formality. I'm going to assume that a lot of people on this call have a loved one that has a Down syndrome diagnosis or some other type of diagnosis related to an intellectual or developmental disability. And so that is going to be a diagnosis that stays with that person throughout the course of their life. However, there is the circumstance that those disability determinations have to be renewed every 5 years. And when those disability determinations aren't renewed, the person loses access to that long-term care, and it can cause a whole host of problems for provider agencies around billing. Which then, when provider agencies have problems with billing, eventually the family gets brought in. I don't say that as a provider agency myself, like kind of complaining about the system. I say it to point out that families want to keep an eye on this to just alleviate any problems because um, the disability determinations are completed by a group that's called the Arbor Review Group or ARG, which in recent years, their determination for or their timeline for completing disability determinations has gotten very, very long. It can take up to 90 days to complete these reviews. So I really encourage families to keep your eye out for any type of notification that you need to do a disability determination, because that could mean that you need to file that potentially up to 90 days in advance before your loved one's eligibility expires. So keep that in mind. That's what a disability determination is, and that it is different than a developmental disability determination. That assessment for whether it be for intelligence and IQ or whether it be for adaptive behavior composite scores, that lasts for a lifetime. The disability determinations are only 5-year dates. And then what happens with that disability determination is that it gets logged into the state system that's called the Colorado Benefits Management System or the CBMS, where they record that disability determination as a diary date. That then, if that diary date expires, that's my last bullet on that side, then the person loses Medicaid eligibility. Okay, that is the Medicaid side. On the waiver side, I've touched on these a little bit, but there's a few terms here that I just want to clarify. I mentioned the 100.2 that can also be called the long-term care certification. That is strangely different than that disability or diary date that I mentioned earlier, but that this long-term care uh, determination is for that someone is at risk for institutional placement, and it's tied to that functional eligibility above. The next three terms on there are assessment, service plan, and care plan. I just want to talk about those for a second because they also get confused and sometimes end up getting used interchangeably in the process. So, from a policy perspective, or if you're talking to your case managers at your case management agencies, when you hear the word assessment, that can mean a few different things. That can mean that 100.2 assessment that I mentioned earlier, where someone is being determined to be at risk for institutional placement. That is one kind of assessment. There is also something called a nurse assessment that is out there right now, where that will be for skilled care services, meaning any type of service that requires a CNA or an RN, or something called health maintenance activities, which is within community first choice. Those kinds of assessments are out there. And so if someone just tells you we need to do an assessment, what I want you to take away from this meeting here is that your first question should be, what kind of assessment? And I might be preaching to the choir, but keep in mind that these kinds of assessments are different than any type of medical assessment that you might be having with a PCP or at the hospital. These are really Medicaid assessments to determine need for services, and they should each be treated just slightly different depending on the context of that assessment. The next two terms I'm going to cover interchangeably because they get used interchangeably, and that is a service plan as compared to a care plan. A service plan is something that is developed by your long-term care case manager at the case management agency. And so I live in Arapahoe County. I'm going to use Developmental Pathways as the example here because they are my local case management agency. Case managers at Developmental Pathways come out, they do that long-term care assessment, the 100.2. They determine that someone is eligible for a waiver, and then they complete the service plan. The service plan is using the outputs from that assessment to say this person needs support with bathing, or this person needs support with eating, or this person needs support with transferring. Whatever the needs are that was identified in that 100.2 assessment, it then gets addressed in the service plan by authorizing the HCBS benefits. So if someone needs support, if they're determined to need support with eating, say it is like hand over hand support with eating, what might get authorized then is personal care. So that way the caregiver can provide hands-on assistance to take hand over hand to go with fork from plate to mouth with eating. That would be the service plan that would get identified there. Units would be authorized because you might say that it takes an hour to eat breakfast, an hour to eat lunch, an hour to eat dinner. So we have 3 hours a day of eating supports that are required. That has to be personal care. And so this person is authorized for 3 hours a day times 7 days a week times 52 weeks a year, whatever that math comes out to be, that is the number of units that get authorized for personal care through the year. Another area for potential service planning could be that if the individual has a goal of being able to get in and out of their home independently over the course of this 12-month period, well, if the barrier is that there's too many steps at the front of the building, the case manager can then complete a service plan to authorize the home modification, or if it's a child on the CES waiver, it's the home accessibility adaptations. It authorizes the services there so that way there can be a home mod that can get moved forward over the course of the next year. The last one on here is the care plan, and this gets confused because if that eating that I was discussing just a moment ago is authorized at 3 hours a day, that authorization gets given to the provider agency, such as Colorado Family Caregivers, who then says, all right, we have 3 hours a day. Our care plan is going to be that for breakfast, we have this caregiver who's going to provide those services. For our agency, that might be mom or dad who is providing those services. And so the care plan identifies that either mom or dad is going to help that child with eating between 8 and 9 a.m. in the morning over the lunch hour, mom and dad are potentially, say, at work or working, but they have another caregiver that comes into the home. Maybe it is an outside caregiver, maybe it is a natural support like a grandmother, aunt, uncle, family friend. They're going to come in, they're going to provide that eating supports over the noon hour to help with lunch, and then in the evening, maybe it's back to mom and dad. The care plan is provider created. Okay, so let me back up to cover that again, just in case that the assessment is completed by the case manager, and that determines functional eligibility for a 12-month period that someone is at risk for institutional placement. The second bullet is the service plan that takes the information from the assessment and develops the services that someone's going to receive over a 12-month period. Okay. And then the care plan is the provider taking those and the services and units that were authorized and saying how they're going to be delivered. So those get used interchangeably a lot, but I just wanted to clarify them for this group. I hope that is helpful. Okay. My next slide I'm going to cover very, very quickly because these are the waivers that are in Colorado. Left-hand side of the screen here is all of our adult waivers. Uh, I find that the adult waivers are relatively straightforward in terms of who they apply to. The brain injury waiver is someone who has completed or has experienced a traumatic brain injury. Community mental health supports waiver that is has a targeting criteria of someone who needs mental health supports in order to remain in the community. They have a specific set of services that helps them remain in the community rather than any type of institutional placement as a result or related to their mental health needs. The complementary and integrated health waiver, that is for people with a spinal cord injury, that if there is any type of spinal cord injury, they can have access to that waiver that provides them access to what I might call regular HCBS services. So on these adult waivers, pretty common for people to have access to personal care, home mods. A couple other services are relatively common there, but the CIH waiver allows access to some what are called alternative therapies, meaning that someone can have access to acupuncture on the CIH waiver. So that is there. Elderly, blind, and disabled waiver. That is the largest of all waivers in Colorado. I believe it's close to like 29,000 people on that particular waiver. And its name is relatively straightforward that it would be for any adult who is either elderly, blind, or disabled. That is that waiver. I've already touched on the DD and SLS waivers that are down below. On the children's side, we've had some changes within the last year. There used to be four children's waivers, and now we are down to three, which, believe it or not, is actually a good thing. I've talked about the CES and CHIRP waivers already. Those are the waivers for children that have an intellectual and developmental disability. I don't have this acronym down yet, but I believe we're referring to it as the CHIN waiver, the Children with Complex Health Needs waiver. That is for children that we would consider to be medically fragile. I actually, when I was at HICPUF, I actually managed one of the waivers that was combined together here for the Chin waiver, it was formerly called the CHCBS waiver, the Children's Home Community-Based Services waiver, where that was for children that had medical needs, that placed them at risk for either skilled nursing facility or hospital placement. So those are the children's waivers. Those are the adults waivers. Each one of these waivers does have its own unique set of services, but these are the waivers in Colorado. I'm going to provide a resource at the end to help explain what all the services in the different waivers are. Okay, I need to pause for a second and divert us just a little bit because I need to touch on something called Community First Choice. That is a new program here in Colorado that actually just launched on July 1st and is a really, really good thing for Colorado. It expanded services, it expanded access to services. It is really, really good thing. That said, I'm in touch with the disability community a lot, and I hear a lot of frustration out there in the community right now because this is changing the system a lot. So I'm going to explain it a little bit, okay? If I go back a couple slides, I had the state plan and I had waiver programs. They were these two kind of silos that are there. Community first choice fits right into the middle of those two silos because technically it is considered to be a state plan option or a state plan program, whatever you want to call it there. It has these whole list of services that are on it as a part of it being a state plan service, but it falls underneath the clause of the Social Security Act that is HCBS. Okay. So community first choice is considered to be HCBS, but it's all state plan services, which means anyone that is on Colorado's Medicaid program has access to all of these services for the purposes of keeping them out of an institutional placement. As an example, if someone were to move into Colorado and they had a need for what I call attendant care, meaning that they are here in Colorado and they need someone to come and provide either homemaker, personal care, or health maintenance activities to them. I'll explain those in just a moment. But if they have to provide any of those three things, a person can now have access to those services without having to go through all of the steps that I talked about before to get onto a waiver. It is much easier to access those attendant services as well as these other services that are on this slide here, which is a very good thing. It has expanded access and it's now also applies to everybody in Colorado, both on the waivers and not on the waivers, which is also important because it means that children now have access to these attendant services. Before July 1st of this year, the only way that a child could get, a medically fragile child could get access to personal care was if they were on the CHCBS waiver and got access to what's called in-home support services through that waiver. That was the only way that a child could get there, which, by the way, in-home support services is what we call a participant direction model, meaning that the person receiving the services has a lot more freedom of choice for how they receive those services. Children could only access that through one waiver before July 1st of this year. Now, with Community First Choice launch, anyone that is on any of the waiver programs, whether they be adult or a child, now has access to both in-home support services or consumer directed attendant support services, or CDOS as it's commonly called, to then be able to direct the care for that child. So regardless of child or adult, they now have access across the board there. Okay. So a really, really good thing. Uh, it is great for everyone. From a provider perspective, what we are seeing as a part of the launch of this program is that now, while services have shifted a little bit, and there are some places where there might be further restrictions on certain services, on the whole, we are finding that both children and adults have access to a much larger volume of services in terms of scope and frequency than what they were before July 1st of this year. If there's anyone on this call today that has questions about CFC, I'm happy to dive into it further. It does take a little while to explain some of the nuances, and I can explain the difference between the different service delivery models, but in the name of time, I'm going to skim over that for just now, okay? That is community first choice. Before I move the slide, I'll repeat myself and say that it provides access to these services to everyone, regardless of age or waiver eligibility and participation. So, a very good thing that is out there. Okay, these are probably the areas, the next slide that I have here of waiver services. These are probably the areas that directly impact people. I might describe them as the places where the rubber meets the road. And I will own that this is where the most interest is. The problem with explaining these waiver services in a presentation like this is that everybody has different interests in specific services, and we could talk about each specific service through a whole hour and a half presentation. So what I have done here is I've just covered what I feel like are the five most common services for the adults as well as the five most common services for children, okay? Across both areas, respite is by far the most common service that I see utilized. It's the most common service that I see get questions about. It is the most common service that people often have the most frustration about as well. So let me talk about respite. Respite is a service that it is waiver specific still. It is not within community first choice, so it does fall into the waivers, and that means that it does have some waiver specific guidelines in it, meaning that I presume most of the people on this call, if your loved one is either on the SLS waiver or the CES waiver, you have access to what's called unskilled respite, meaning that anyone can provide that respite care. If you are the primary caregiver, that respite service is for the relief of you. And so you can have someone come in to be a respite caregiver for you without them having any type of qualifications in terms of a CNA or an RN. There are other waivers that have what's called skilled respite. That CHIN waiver, or the complex health needs waiver, that waiver does have respite services when an RN is needed to provide that relief. Okay. But for the CES and SLS waivers, if you, as the primary caregiver, are in need of relief, whether that be you're just need an hour at the end of your day to just you've been taking care of your child, whether they be a minor child or an adult child, you need an hour to just kind of step away. You can have a respite caregiver come in and provide 1 hour of respite care at the end of the day. You could also, if it is a circumstance where you want to have a date night, primary caregiver and their partner want to go have a date night on Friday, they can use that respite service and have any caregiver come in and provide that respite service so that way you can have that one night off. There is also something called respite day, which would be for circumstances where that respite is needed for 10 hours or more. So if someone is going to say it's a circumstance where it's the mother and father of a child on the CES waiver and they want to go on a vacation for a long weekend, they could potentially be in a circumstance where grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle or whatever natural support uh, becomes a respite caregiver to then provide respite while mom and dad go take a vacation over the weekend or whatever that circumstance is. The key to remember about respite is that it has to be for the circumstances of providing relief to the primary caregiver. The on the adult side, then what we see is day programs. If we have anyone that is in the SLS or DD waivers, these are going to be either supported community connections or something called specialized habilitation or SPECHAB. Those are those day programs. If you're on the physical disability side, so like the EBD waiver, those programs are just called adult day. These are programs that, as the name implies, that the waiver participant goes to these programs during the day, so that way they have a caregiver taking care of them, and they are an active participant in their community. Day programs vary from agency to agency. They can be anything from one-on-one services, where there's a day program provider that is taking that person out and doing like connections with the community, whether that be at a park or at a museum, to group programs where you see day programs taking the adults to the library or also to the museums or whatever they are doing. The adult programs do have residential services. There's only the CHIRP waiver that I mentioned earlier has residential programs for children. There's also some transportation that gets used a lot. Children, we talked about respite. There is Community Connector. That's a very common service on the CES waiver. That is to circumstances where a caregiver can help the child become active in their community by using the community as a learning environment. Very highly utilized service under the CES waiver. Uh, Children on the CES waiver also have access to home modifications and something called extraordinary cleaning. If anyone on this call has questions about extraordinary cleaning, I'm happy to answer them. I'm running short on time. I want to leave space for um, questions after this, but happy to dig into extraordinary cleaning and some of the changes happening around it. I also like to note that the children's waivers have assistive technology for helping out with iPad purchases or yeah, iPad purchases are probably the best example there. So those are the services. There's a lot more out there on the different waivers. Here in just a moment, I'm going to stop my sharing my screen and I'm going to go grab a couple links to some other resources that I'll throw into the chat. And then I'll share with Heidi after this so that can be distributed with the recording. Because Eric, I see your question in the chat. I believe that the recording will be shared out later on. I don't know how Heidi and her team will share it out, but we will have access to that afterwards. And I'll share that'll get shared out as well as these resources that I'm going to drop into the chat in just a moment. Um, Before I stop sharing, I'll give everybody a second. If you're interested, you can either take a screenshot or jot down this information here that's on my screen. This is all of our contact information. If you need to reach our support team, if you're already receiving services through our agency, you can reach out to our support team. If you have interest in starting to receive services from our agency, you can call in or email, and either myself or someone from our team, happy to get back with you. We pride ourselves on being able to onboard caregivers and clients right around a week in a perfect world. And so if you're looking for an agency, you can come to us there. If you just have questions for me, if you're served by a different agency and you just have kind of policy questions that you want help with, I'm happy to answer those to the best I can. There's my contact information and our agency's website as well. Um, so that is that. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this, and we can start talking any type of questions that might be out there. As soon as I remember how to stop sharing in Zoom.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Yep. I, I
And
hope that was help. I hope that was helpful. That was a lot of just like me talking to a microphone, so I hope it's helpful for everybody.
it was very helpful for me.
Okay.
Definitely a lot of positive changes. Let's see. I know it's strange that less can be more with the some of the waivers getting consolidated and
Right.
going away.
Um, I vividly remember when I interviewed for my first like Medicaid job back in 2013, having a conversation with the woman who is now the director of the Office of Community
Oh,
Living,
it's
Bonnie
with
Philp.
Bonnie. Yeah.
Yeah, she
Mhm.
interviewed me for my first job way back in the day, Heidi. Yeah, and she was explaining to me because I had no idea what Medicaid was, and she was like, Colorado has the most waivers of any state in the United States because at that time we actually had 12, and her very vividly saying like, oh, and that's not a good thing because it made the
Hmm.
system so complicated. Here, 12 years later, I'm pretty proud of the fact that as a state we have made it a little bit more simple. We're down from a practical sense, we're down from 12 down to 9 waivers. That's simple. We don't have the complication of single entry points versus community center boards anymore. That has made it much more simple. And it still took me 45 minutes to just roll through everything here. And I could have kept going for another hour if you guys really had the
Yeah, no,
patience to listen to me.
it's been quite a journey. I
Yep.
I think we someone did have a question about and so you might want to just share more a little bit, but they said what is more comprehensive, DD or SLS?
Good question. RD, I'm gonna assume by comprehensive you're referring to like which is the better set of services that are available there. And since you asked that question, I'll try to dig into this just a little bit. So, Ironically, the DD waiver, so the developmental disabilities waiver, that historically was called the comp waiver because it was the comprehensive waiver. You will every now and then, if you're talking to people that have really been in the system for a while, they'll refer to it as the comp waiver still. That comes from the fact that the DD waiver has residential habilitation on it, which is 24/7 care for someone that's on that waiver. Traditionally, or let me change my word there. Initially, when the DD waiver was launched, that residential care was in group homes. That if someone was on the DD waiver and they weren't going to be in a true facility, they would be put into a group home where they might live with, say, 8 to 12 people within this group home, and it would be everybody living there in that group home together. We called that community-based services at the time. As our system has evolved, we've said, well, that's really just institutions by a different name, is largely what it was. In addition to us calling it institutions by a different name, there's a lot of funding problems with group homes because the pay rate here in Colorado for group homes is just not sustainable for provider agencies. So we only have a handful of those group homes available anymore. Now, most of the time, when you hear about residential services, you are hearing about either host home circumstances, where it's maybe 2 to 4 people on the DD waiver that are living in one host home, where there is a caregiver that lives in that home full time. So that way, there is someone there that is providing those services 24/7 to that whole household. And those DD waiver participants there can have their own space, have their home there that they live in. There's quite a few host homes around in Colorado, especially, like I said, I'm in Arapahoe County. The south half of the metro has quite a few host homes. But we're even seeing in recent years a lot more of people not even wanting to be in host homes as much anymore, as they're moving to what we sometimes call PCA settings, or personal care alternative settings, which I wish I knew who came up with that title, because I hate that it's personal care because it sounds like an overlap with the actual personal care services. But a PCA setting would be some kind of situation where the person on the DD waiver is receiving that 24 care, but they might have their own, say, apartment. It might be someone has their own apartment that maybe, if we're talking an adult on the DD waiver, maybe they have signed their lease or co-signed it with their parents to have that lease, but then they have a DD waiver residential agency come in and check on that person daily. So maybe they're checking in the morning to make sure that that person gets up and gets ready to go to work for the day, or they're checking in at night to say, hey, did you take your medications? Did you cook dinner? Whatever it is. You can have these PCA settings where someone is largely living independently, but they have that kind of regular check-in as well as an emergency 24-hour support if that's needed. So, RD, I don't know if that actually answered your question, but because of that residential services there, I would say that the DD waiver is more comprehensive because you can have access to that, and that gives the person on the waiver program access to 24/7 worth of services. The downside of the DD waiver is that it has a wait list. That's like the dirtiest word out there in HCBS world right now, is that the DD waiver has a wait list that is quite long. If anyone on this call has a child who is currently on the CES waiver and that child is under the age of 14, please go to your calendars now and mark their 14th birthday in your calendar, because on their 14th birthday, you need to call your case manager and have your child added to the DD waivers wait list. So that way, when they turn 18, they have a spot on to potentially move onto the DD waiver at that time, or you're at least preserve that date on the wait list. Because last I heard, I believe it's like 3,500 people that are waiting to get onto the DD waiver and to get access to those services. Um, because of that, there's a lot more interest in the SLS waiver. People are staying on the SLS waiver, especially now with the launch of Community First Choice. Uh, a lot of families are finding that they can meet their loved ones' needs through a combination of the CFC services and the SLS waiver while they're waiting to get access to the DD waiver. A lot of word vomit there from me. I hope that made sense, RD. Let me know if you have any other questions about that. Um, Catherine, I see your question. Let me come back to that because I see Pam's there that the PCA setting requires the DD waiver. Yes, any type of setting that is residential for the IDD system would require the DD waiver. The supported living services or SLS waiver does not have residential services. Um, the slight caveat on that is that if someone would qualify for the EBD waiver, they would have access to a residential service called an alternative care facility or an ACF, which those agencies are starting to morph towards PCA, but they're not quite true PCA. To get true PCA, you'd have to be on the DD waiver. Hope that helps, Pam. Catherine, let me read your question here. Congratulations, Catherine. That's exciting. I hope next week goes well for you. I would say, in terms of your first step, um, Heidi, I might actually defer to you just a little bit of this. From an advocacy perspective, you might know some of this a little bit better than I do.
Yeah.
Catherine, Catherine, depending on medical status, I do encourage you to get in touch with your case management agency as soon as possible. If there are any type of medical complications, you might be interested in the Children with Complex Health Needs waiver. But barring some type of medical diagnosis, I'll defer to Heidi for like more community resources and what to do in those first couple of years there.
Yeah, and Catherine, so I don't know if obviously you found out about this webinar, so that means that sorry. So sorry, my dogs are getting excited. So
Oh,
you must have know a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Down Syndrome Association. But one of the things that we do is we do talk a lot to parents that got a prenatal diagnosis, and then we have staff in our family programs division, and they're parents of children with Down syndrome. We have a mom and a dad, and that's Megan Gilby. And so, if you want to reach out to us tomorrow, we can sort of talk to you from that standpoint and then sort of walk you through typically how that would happen at the hospital. Gilby is actually married to someone named Jocelyn, who was a social worker at Children's Hospital. So he's got a really good lay of the land there. And then we can help, if you're not sure who your case management agency is, too, we can help figure that out with you and sort of get you in contact with somebody over there, too. So, if you want to just reach out to us tomorrow, we can kind of do whatever we can to get you ready for next week, and then we'll be around long after that, as long as you need us.
Thank you very much. I'll reach out.
Yeah, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see.
I think that's everything in the chat.
Okay, all right.
Oh, there's one. Lisa, I hope I'm saying your name correct there. Please correct me if I'm not saying it right. If your child is currently on the CHIN waiver, I- again, I think that's the acronym we're going by, but the complex health needs waiver, we be turning 13. What I would say that as you transition to an adult is start the conversation now for what you want your son's life to look like at age 25. Because looking at age 25 or potentially even 30, that will help you decide what type of waiver you want to pursue when he turns 18. Okay. That might sound like a little bit of a non-answer, but I encourage families to take that kind of perspective to think about do you either want your son or will your son require you, be required to still live with you when he is at 25 years of age or 30 years of age? Because if you want or need him to be in your home when he's 25 or 30, that could mean that you potentially go towards the EBD waiver. He could be on the EBD waiver, and then using community first choice, you potentially access something called CDOS. I mentioned it earlier, it's Consumer Directed Attendant Support Services. You could then be his caregiver, depending on what his health needs are. You could potentially go that route. He is living in your home, has access to those waiver services. You would have the flexibility to potentially, okay, Down syndrome and autism. Okay. Um, if it's in that case for you, I think the question then goes to still, is he going to be living with you? Because I might lean towards either the DD waiver or the SLS waiver. With those diagnoses there, I hate ever doing any kind of service planning diagnosis based. But that said, what I might infer a little bit there is that with the DD waiver or the SLS waiver, you could have some flexibility around what type of residential services he provides. If you want to go the full DD waiver, you could go the PCA route, so that way you are being paid in your home to care for him on that 24-hour a day basis. You would have that kind of flexibility, but he would also have access to supported employment services to go get a job, or even if he doesn't get a job, he could get access to like job coaching, so that way uh, he could at least pursue it from that perspective. If you went the more physical disability route in terms of waiver choices, like the EBD waiver would be the most applicable there. You might have access to a couple different services, but the key thing for me is you wouldn't have access to those supported employment things. I hope that helps, Lisa. The key, though, either route is talk to your case manager. If he has a Down syndrome diagnosis and autism diagnosis, get onto that the DD waivers wait list at on his 14th birthday, because when his 18th birthday rolls around, you will have the option to go directly from the waiver onto DD at that point, if you want to. Okay. If you don't want to, you can turn down the DD option when he turns 18. There is something called emergency placement or reserved capacity for the DD waiver of when someone is turning 18, they can roll directly from the CES waiver onto the DD waiver. And so if you wanted to go that route as the next few years go by, you would first move on to the CES waiver, and then when he turns 18, you could go directly onto the DD waiver to have access to that. But if you don't get onto that wait list on his 14th birthday, it puts you behind in the line down the road when you might want to get to it later on. Okay. Case manager turnover is a thing. I am sorry to hear that. I am hearing that our agency works with seven different case management agencies statewide, and case management turnover is a real thing. I say that as someone who used to supervise case managers at Developmental Pathways. It is a thing, unfortunately. I will say that it is a very thankless job. So I believe, are we actually in case management week right now, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, I think I saw that. The-
Um, so I will say this to everyone that's on this call. If you have a case manager right now that you appreciate, please send them some thanks. It is a very thankless job. Really, a lot of times people only contact their case manager when things are going wrong, and so they don't hear good news very often. So be sure to thank your case manager if you have one that you like. I'll just leave that at that. Okay. JLB asks for the LTC assessment for the CES waiver. Do you know what criteria are for overnight care needs to qualify for it? Great question, JLB. This is one that was too far into the weeds for me to address as a part of my regular presentation, but I'll dig into it right now since you asked. The CES waiver has as a part of its targeting criteria, right? So it's specific there that the CES waiver requires a child to both have that developmental disability determination, whether either a determination or a delay, and they have something that is commonly referred to as the nighttime criteria out there. Or you'll sometimes hear parents say, "Oh, he doesn't sleep overnight. He or she doesn't sleep overnight, so he doesn't qualify for the CES waiver." What the nighttime criteria refers to is that waiver requires that a child on aggregate can't go more than 5 hours without supervision, some type of getting up and moving around. So if a child sleeps through the night, they can go more than 5 hours without having some type of intervention, and so that would disqualify them for the CES waiver. Where it gets complicated and where I encourage parents to point out to case managers as you're filling out the CES waiver application is that sometimes parents they forget that their child might be on some medications and that there might be medications that's in impacting the level of intervention that a child has. As an example, if a child has, say, a prescription for some type of sleeping medication, whether it be kind of what I think it's trazodone is kind of the old school one. I'm not up on some of my sleeping medications right now, but if a child is taking a sleeping med, that sleeping med doesn't disqualify them from the waiver. We can't just kick kids off of the CES waiver because they're on a medication that helps them sleep through the night. Talk it through with the case manager to say, he can't go more than 5 hours without an intervention because I'm giving him this medication. If we don't give him that medication, here's what he or she is doing, and so he requires more than that 5 hours of intervention. Um, JLB, I hope that helps out with that overnight thing in terms of the assessment and filling out that application. It's that 5 hour mark and not necessarily the sleeping that is required there.
I was on mute. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording then, I think.